The hollow sound of Elizabeth Nightingale's growling stomach echoed through the dark pantry where she huddled, her thin fingers trembling as they reached for a single bread crust that had fallen beneath the lowest shelf. At 22, she had become skilled at finding the overlooked crumbs that might keep her alive another day in the Hargrove household, where she had served as maid for nearly 3 years of increasing cruelty and starvation. "Girl, where are you hiding, Mrs.?" Hargrove's shrill voice pierced the silence of the spacious home that sat on the outskirts of Ash Fork, Arizona. The year was 1885, and while the small town was prospering with the recent railroad expansion, Elizabeth's world had shrunk to a prison of domestic servitude. Elizabeth quickly shoved the bread crust into her pocket and emerged from the pantry, smoothing down her threadbare dress. "Here, madam. I was just checking the inventory as you requested." Beatrice Hargrove, a woman whose plump face perpetually held an expression of dissatisfaction, narrowed her eyes. "The floors in the parlor are not clean enough for tonight's gathering. Do them again, and mind you don't steal any food while we're entertaining." Mr. Hargrove noticed supplies missing last month. "Yes, madam," Elizabeth replied, lowering her gaze to hide the flash of indignation. The missing supplies had been nothing more than a few stale crackers she'd taken when the hunger pains had become unbearable. Since then, they'd locked the food storage more securely and reduced her already meager meals to practically nothing. As Mrs. Hargrove swept away, Elizabeth returned to the parlor, her knees aching as she knelt once more to scrub the already gleaming wooden floors. The Hargroves were hosting the town's most prominent citizens tonight, a regular occurrence that served to remind everyone of their wealth and standing in Ash Fork. For Elizabeth, it meant extra work and the torture of serving elaborate meals she wasn't permitted to taste. She had come to the Hargroves after her parents died of fever, leaving her penniless. With no relatives and few options for a young woman alone, she had accepted the position with gratitude, not knowing it would become her prison. What had begun as strict employment had gradually transformed into something closer to indentured servitude, as they withheld her wages for invented infractions and isolated her from the town. The afternoon wore on, and Elizabeth's hands grew raw from the lye soap. Her vision occasionally blurred, a symptom of the hunger that had become her constant companion. She had learned to function despite it, to ignore the painful contraction of her empty stomach, the weakness in her limbs, the dizziness that came upon her without warning. By evening, the Hargrove home was transformed. Candles glowed in silver holders, fresh flowers adorned every surface, and the aroma of roast beef and apple pie prepared by Elizabeth under Mrs. Hargrove's exacting supervision filled the air. Elizabeth's mouth watered involuntarily as she carried platters to the dining room, knowing she would be allowed nothing but perhaps a cup of thin broth before bed. The guests arrived in a flurry of fine clothes and boisterous greetings. Mr. Hargrove, a tall man with a thick mustache and cold eyes, welcomed each one with a practiced joviality that never extended to his servants. Elizabeth moved among them like a ghost, refilling glasses and removing empty plates, trying to be invisible. "I heard the Collins Ranch had some trouble with cattle rustlers," one man was saying as Elizabeth leaned in to collect his plate. "Nothing compared to what they're facing now," Mr. Hargrove replied. "Old man Collins passed last winter, and his nephew's taken over. Young fellow from Texas, Xavier Eastwood. Folks say he's got some wild ideas about running things." Elizabeth paused momentarily. She had heard whispers about the new owner of the Collins Ranch. Some said he was fair-minded, others claimed he was reckless, but all agreed he was not a man to be trifled with. "He's coming tonight, isn't he?" Mrs. Hargrove inquired, her voice tinged with excitement at hosting someone new. Said he would, her husband answered. Though these cowboy types aren't known for their punctuality. As if on cue, a knock sounded at the door. Elizabeth hurried to answer it, grateful for the momentary escape from the stuffy dining room. She pulled open the heavy oak door to find a tall figure silhouetted against the deepening twilight. "Evening, miss," came a deep voice as the man stepped into the light of the entryway. "Xavier Eastwood, I believe I'm expected." Elizabeth found herself looking up at a man, perhaps 5 or 6 years her senior. He had a strong jawline softened by the shadow of a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes the color of a summer storm. Unlike the other guests, he wasn't dressed in formal attire but wore clean dark trousers, a simple white shirt, and a vest. A cowboy hat was held respectfully in his hands. "Yes, sir. Please come in," Elizabeth managed, suddenly aware of how she must appear thin, pale in her faded gray dress. Xavier's eyes lingered on her face for a moment longer than propriety dictated, a slight furrow appearing between his brows. Then he nodded and followed her to the dining room. "Ah, Eastwood. We were beginning to think you wouldn't make it," Mr. Hargrove declared, rising to shake the newcomer's hand. "Had a situation with a foaling mare," Xavier explained, accepting the handshake briefly. "Couldn't leave her until I knew she and the colt would pull through." Elizabeth retreated to the kitchen as the conversation continued, but she could feel Xavier Eastwood's gaze following her. It wasn't the leering look she sometimes received from other men. There was something else in it, curiosity, perhaps, or concern. The dinner stretched on, course after course that Elizabeth served with practiced efficiency despite her growing weakness. As she leaned in to place a dish of glazed carrots on the table, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She swayed slightly, the room spinning around her. A strong hand caught her elbow, steadying her. "Careful there," Xavier said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, mortified. "Please excuse my clumsiness." His eyes narrowed as he took in her trembling hands and the hollows of her cheeks. Before he could respond, Mrs. Hargrove's voice cut through the moment. "Elizabeth, bring the dessert immediately. You're keeping our guests waiting." "Yes, madam." Elizabeth pulled away from Xavier's steadying grip and hurried back to the kitchen. The evening finally drew to a close near midnight. Elizabeth stood at the door, helping guests with their coats and bidding them good night on behalf of the Hargroves. Xavier Eastwood was among the last to leave. As he took his hat from her outstretched hands, he spoke in a low tone. "You don't look well, miss." Elizabeth stiffened. "I'm quite all right, sir. When did you last eat?" The directness of his question startled her. "That's not I mean, she stammered. "They starve you, don't they?" His voice was soft but held a dangerous edge. Elizabeth glanced nervously over her shoulder. "Please, sir." "I'll lose my position if they hear." Xavier's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I understand." He settled his hat on his head, then paused. "The Collins Ranch needs a housekeeper, decent pay, regular meals. If you ever find yourself in need of new employment, Miss Elizabeth Nightingale, Miss Nightingale, my door is open to you." With that, he tipped his hat and stepped out into the night. Elizabeth closed the door behind him, her mind racing. A new position, the very thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. But the Hargroves would never let her go willingly. They had made it clear that she owed them for taking her in, for the roof over her head, for the meager scraps they provided. And where would she go if she left? The Collins Ranch was miles from town, and she had no means of transportation. "Elizabeth," Mr. Hargrove's voice called, "come clean up this mess, and be quick about it. We don't pay you to dawdle." Elizabeth hurried back to the dining room, her brief moment of hope fading as she faced the mountain of dishes and glasses left behind. It was well past 2 in the morning before she finished cleaning, and Mrs. Hargrove grudgingly handed her a small piece of stale bread before sending her to her tiny attic room. Alone in the darkness, Elizabeth curled up on her thin mattress, stomach still aching with hunger, and thought about Xavier Eastwood's offer. It seemed like a fantasy: regular meals, decent pay. But for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a different life. The next morning, Elizabeth was up before dawn as usual, lighting fires and preparing breakfast for the Hargroves. The lingering effects of the previous night's celebration had put both master and mistress in foul moods, and Elizabeth bore the brunt of their displeasure. "This coffee is too weak," Mr. Hargrove complained, pushing away his cup. "Can't you do anything right, girl?" "I'm sorry, sir. I'll make fresh immediately," Elizabeth replied, taking the cup with hands that still ached from yesterday's work. "And where's the milk?" Mrs. Hargrove demanded. "I specifically told you to fetch fresh milk this morning." Elizabeth froze. You did, madam, but you also asked me to have breakfast ready by 6. I haven't had time to go to town yet." Mrs. Hargrove's face darkened. "Are you contradicting me, girl, after all we've done for you?" "No, madam, you ungrateful wretch. We took you in when no one else would have you, and this is how you repay us, with excuses and back talk. I'm sorry, madam, I'll go right away." "You certainly will, and you can forget about any breakfast for yourself today. Perhaps hunger will improve your memory and your attitude." Elizabeth bit her lip to keep from protesting. It would do no good, and she knew from experience that arguing would only make things worse. She quickly donned her threadbare shawl and took the milk jug, stepping out into the crisp morning air. The walk to town was just over a mile, and normally Elizabeth would have savored these brief escapes from the Hargrove household. Today, however, her empty stomach and lightheadedness made each step an effort. She had eaten virtually nothing the day before except for the crust and the small piece of bread before bed. Ash Fork was beginning to stir as she arrived, shopkeepers opening their doors and freight wagons rumbling down the main street. The railroad had brought new life to the town in recent years, transforming it from a quiet outpost to a bustling community. Elizabeth passed the general store, the blacksmith shop, and finally reached the small dairy at the edge of town. "Morning, Miss Nightingale," the dairy owner, Mr. Peterson, greeted her. "The usual for the Hargroves?" "Yes, please," she replied, offering a small smile. As Mr. Peterson filled her jug, he studied her with concern. "You're looking peaked, miss. Everything all right?" Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. "Just tired from last night's dinner party." "Heard it was quite the affair," he said, handing her the filled container. "That new rancher was there, wasn't he? Eastwood, what you make of him?" he seemed. Elizabeth hesitated, unsure how to describe Xavier Eastwood. "Kind," she finally said. Mr. Peterson nodded thoughtfully. "Folks say he treats his hands fair, pays good wages too." He lowered his voice. "Not like some employers I could mention." Elizabeth glanced around nervously, but Mr. Peterson just winked at her. "You take care now, miss, and eat something, will you? You're nothing but skin and bones." "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," she murmured, handing over the coins Mrs. Hargrove had given her. The walk back seemed even longer, the weight of the milk jug pulling at her arms. By the time Elizabeth reached the Hargrove house, her vision was swimming, dark spots dancing before her eyes. She paused at the gate, trying to collect herself. "Miss Nightingale." The familiar, deep voice startled her. Elizabeth turned to see Xavier Eastwood approaching on horseback, leading a second horse laden with supplies. "Mr. Eastwood," she acknowledged, cursing the weakness that made her voice tremble. Xavier dismounted in one fluid motion, his eyes taking in her pale face and the slight sway in her stance. "You shouldn't be carrying that, not in your condition." Before she could protest, He had taken the heavy milk jug from her hands. "When did you last eat, Miss Nightingale?" Elizabeth looked away. "I'm fine, sir, truly." "That's not what I asked." She hesitated, then answered honestly. "Yesterday morning, a little bread." Xavier's expression hardened. "That's not enough to keep a bird alive, let alone a grown woman. Please, Mr. Eastwood. I need to take this inside before it's missed." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll carry it to the door for you." "That's not necessary, I insist," he said firmly, already walking toward the house. Elizabeth hurried after him, terrified of what the Hargroves might say if they saw her with a man at the door, especially this man, whom they were so eager to impress. Fortunately, when they reached the front porch, no one appeared. Xavier handed her the milk jug, his fingers brushing against hers in the process. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her cold hands. "Thank you," she said softly. "Miss Nightingale," he began, then seemed to reconsider his words. "Elizabeth, my offer stands. There's honest work at my ranch with fair treatment." She clutched the milk jug tighter. "I can't just leave. The Hargroves, they what?" His voice was gentle but insistent. "They say I owe them for taking me in after my parents died. They haven't paid me my wages in over a year, claiming I owe them for room and board, for a dress that was torn, for dishes that were broken." Xavier's expression darkened. "That's not employment, Elizabeth. That's bondage." She couldn't argue with him. She knew he was right, had known it for months, perhaps years. But the fear of having nowhere to go, of being alone in the world, had kept her chained to the Hargroves as surely as any physical restraint. "I have to go," she whispered. "They'll be angry if I'm delayed." "I'm heading to town tomorrow," Xavier said. "I'll be at the general store around noon. If you can get away, meet me there." Before Elizabeth could respond, the front door swung open, revealing Mrs. Hargrove's suspicious face. "What's going on here?" she demanded, eyes darting between Elizabeth and Xavier. Xavier smoothly tipped his hat. "Good morning, Mrs. Hargrove. I was just passing by and noticed your maid struggling with this heavy jug. Thought I'd lend a hand." Mrs. Hargrove's expression shifted instantly from suspicion to fawning delight. "Mr. Eastwood, how gallant of you. Won't you come in for coffee?" "Thank you, madam, but I'm afraid I have business in town." His eyes flickered briefly to Elizabeth. "Perhaps another time." As he mounted his horse, Mrs. Hargrove's smile faded. She grabbed Elizabeth's arm roughly and pulled her inside, closing the door firmly behind them. "What were you doing, talking to a man like that?" she hissed. "Do you think someone of his standing would look twice at a skinny little nobody like you?" "It was nothing, madam." As he said, he was just helping with the milk. Mrs. Hargrove narrowed her eyes. "See that it stays that way. Now get to work. The breakfast dishes are waiting, and the parlor needs dusting before my sewing circle arrives at 10. Elizabeth spent the day in a fog, mechanically completing her chores while her mind turned over Xavier's offer. The chance to escape the Hargroves was tantalizing, but the risk was enormous. If she tried to leave and failed, her situation would surely worsen. And what if Xavier Eastwood's promises of fair treatment were no better than the Hargroves'? She had no way of knowing if she could trust him. By evening, Elizabeth was swaying on her feet. Mrs. Hargrove had kept her word. No food had been allowed all day, and Elizabeth had been worked harder than usual, as if her mistress was punishing her for the morning's encounter. As she prepared the Hargrove's supper, the rich aroma of beef stew made her stomach cramp painfully. Elizabeth found herself staring at the pot, momentarily mesmerized by the steam rising from it. "Are you stealing food?" Mr. Hargrove's accusation cut through her hunger-induced trance. He stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her with cold, suspicious eyes. "No, sir. I was just stirring the stew." He strode forward and grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully. "Empty your pockets." "Sir, please empty them." With trembling fingers, Elizabeth turned out her pockets. They contained nothing but a handkerchief and a small sewing kit she used for mending. Mr. Hargrove released her wrist with a shove that sent her stumbling against the stove. "Serve our dinner. And remember, girl, one more incident like this morning, one more time I catch you getting familiar with the townspeople or our guests, and you'll be out on your ear with nothing but the clothes on your back. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," she whispered, rubbing her bruised wrist. That night, as Elizabeth lay on her thin mattress, she made her decision. Whatever awaited her at the Collins Ranch, now the Eastwood Ranch, it couldn't be worse than her current situation. Tomorrow, somehow, she would find a way to meet Xavier at the general store. Morning brought a stroke of unexpected fortune. Mrs. Hargrove's sewing circle had used the last of her special tea, and she insisted Elizabeth go to town immediately to replenish it. It was the perfect opportunity. "And don't dawdle," Mrs. Hargrove warned as she handed Elizabeth a few coins. "I want you back within the hour." "Yes, madam," Elizabeth replied, carefully keeping her face neutral despite the hope fluttering in her chest. The walk to town seemed shorter than usual, propelled as she was by the prospect of freedom. It was just after 11 when she arrived at the general store, which meant she would have to wait for Xavier's arrival. She made her purchase quickly, then lingered outside, heart pounding with anxiety. What if he didn't come? What if Mrs. Hargrove sent someone to look for her? What if Miss Nightingale? Elizabeth turned to find Xavier approaching on foot, his tall figure unmistakable even in the busy street. Relief washed over her. Mr. Eastwood. He studied her face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands. "Have you eaten today?" She shook her head. Without another word, he took her elbow and guided her toward the small cafe next to the general store. "First things first." Elizabeth hesitated at the doorway. "I can't. Mrs. Hargrove is expecting me back, and I have no money for I'm inviting you," Xavier said firmly. "And we'll deal with the Hargroves after you've had a proper meal." The cafe was warm and smelled of fresh bread and coffee. Xavier led her to a table in the corner and signaled to the waitress. "Bring whatever's hot and plentiful," he told the young woman. "And coffee, please." As the waitress hurried away, Xavier turned his attention back to Elizabeth. "You've decided to accept my offer." Elizabeth twisted her hands in her lap. "Yes, if it still stands." "It does." His gaze was steady, reassuring. "I need someone to manage the house. Cook, clean, keep things in order. It's just me and a few ranch hands at present. The work won't be easy, but it will be fairly compensated. And I would be free to leave if I wished, if things didn't suit." A shadow crossed his face, but he nodded firmly. "You're not a prisoner, Elizabeth. You'll be a paid employee with all the rights that entails." The waitress returned with a steaming bowl of stew, a plate of biscuits, and a cup of coffee. Elizabeth stared at the food, her mouth watering painfully. "Eat," Xavier encouraged, "until you're full here." She needed no further invitation, though she forced herself to start slowly, afraid her shrunken stomach might rebel. Elizabeth soon found herself devouring the stew and biscuits with an intensity that might have embarrassed her under different circumstances. Xavier watched in silence, occasionally sipping his own coffee, his expression unreadable. When she finally sat back, unable to take another bite, Elizabeth felt a flush of shame creep up her neck. "I'm sorry. You must think me terribly ill-mannered." "What I think," Xavier said quietly, "is that you've been treated abominably. No one should ever be denied food, especially someone working as hard as you clearly do." Elizabeth looked down at her empty bowl. "How did you know?" "That night at the dinner party, how did you guess they were starving me?" "I've seen hunger before," he answered simply. And I've seen how people like the Hargroves treat those they consider beneath them. He paused. My mother was in service when she was young, before she married my father. Some of her employers were kind, others were not. The personal revelation surprised Elizabeth. It was hard to imagine this capable, confident man having any connection to the world of domestic service. "What happens now?" she asked, glancing nervously at the clock on the cafe wall. She had already been gone longer than Mrs. Hargrove's allotted hour. "Now we settle your affairs with the Hargroves and collect your belongings." Elizabeth shook her head. "They won't let me go. Mr. Hargrove said just last night that if I tried to leave, he'd—" She broke off, unwilling to repeat the threats. Xavier's jaw tightened. "They have no right to keep you against your will. They say I owe them. For room and board, for broken items, how much?" Elizabeth blinked. I don't know exactly. They've never given me an accounting." "Then we'll ask for one." Xavier stood and offered his hand. "Come, the longer you delay, the harder it will be." Elizabeth hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, and for the first time in years, she felt something like safety. They walked back to the Hargrove house together, Xavier insisting on taking the parcel of tea from her. As they approached the imposing structure, Elizabeth's steps slowed, fear threatening to overtake her newfound courage. Xavier seemed to sense her hesitation. "I won't leave you alone with them," he promised. "Whatever happens, you're not going back to that life." Mr. Hargrove himself answered the door, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion when he saw Xavier standing beside Elizabeth. "Eastwood, what brings you here?" His eyes narrowed as they fell on Elizabeth. "And what took you so long, girl? My wife has been waiting for her tea." Xavier stepped forward slightly, subtly positioning himself between Elizabeth and Mr. Hargrove. "May we come in, Hargrove? I have a matter of business to discuss with you." Reluctantly, Mr. Hargrove stepped aside, his suspicious gaze never leaving Elizabeth as they entered. Mrs. Hargrove emerged from the parlor, her face thunderous. "Where have you been?" she demanded of Elizabeth. "I told you an hour not," she broke off, noticing Xavier for the first time. "Mr. Eastwood, what a pleasant surprise, Mrs. Hargrove." Xavier nodded politely but without warmth. "I'll be brief. I've offered Miss Nightingale a position at my ranch and she has accepted." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Hargrove's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. "That's impossible. Elizabeth is contracted to us. May I see this contract?" Mr. Hargrove shifted uncomfortably. "It's a verbal agreement. Her parents died owing us money. She works to repay the debt." "My parents owed you nothing," Elizabeth said quietly, surprising herself with her boldness. "You made that up to keep me here after you realized how convenient it was to have someone you didn't have to pay." Mrs. Hargrove gasped. "How dare you? After all we've done for you." "What exactly have you done for her?" Xavier interrupted, his voice dangerously soft. "Besides working her to exhaustion and starving her half to death." "This is outrageous," Mr. Hargrove sputtered. "You have no right to come into my home and make such accusations." "Then deny them," Xavier challenged. "Tell me Elizabeth is paid fair wages. Tell me she eats the same food you do. Tell me she's not afraid of you." The Hargroves exchanged glances, momentarily at a loss for words. "She owes us," Mrs. Hargrove finally stated flatly. "For room and board, for items broken, how much?" Xavier demanded. "What? How much does she owe you? Name your figure." Mr. Hargrove's eyes narrowed calculatingly. $100. It was an outrageous sum, more than a year's wages for a domestic servant. Elizabeth gasped at the audacity of it, but Xavier didn't even blink. "I'll give you 50, he countered. "Cash, right now." Mr. Hargrove's face flushed with greed and anger. 75. 50, Xavier repeated firmly. And you sign a paper stating the debt is paid in full and Elizabeth is free to seek employment elsewhere. Otherwise, I take this matter to the sheriff, along with my concerns about your treatment of her. The threat hung in the air. Everyone in the room knew that Sheriff Tanner was no friend of the Hargroves, having had several run-ins with them over their treatment of townspeople and previous servants. "Fine," Mr. Hargrove spat. 50 it is. Xavier pulled a leather wallet from his vest pocket and counted out the bills. "Write the receipt," he instructed. "And while you do that, Elizabeth will gather her belongings. Mrs. Hargrove made as if to follow Elizabeth, but Xavier's cold stare stopped her. "She goes alone." Elizabeth hurried up to her attic room, her heart racing. She had precious few possessions: a change of clothes, her mother's hairbrush, a small Bible, and a faded photograph of her parents. She wrapped them in a handkerchief, taking one last look at the tiny space that had been her prison for 3 years. When she returned downstairs, Xavier was holding a signed paper. Mr. Hargrove's face was purple with suppressed rage, while Mrs. Hargrove looked as though she'd swallowed something sour. "Ready?" Xavier asked, offering Elizabeth his arm. She nodded, clutching her small bundle. "This isn't over, girl," Mr. Hargrove growled as they reached the door. "You'll regret this decision." Xavier turned back, his expression cold. "Threaten her again, Hargrove, and you'll be dealing with me. Is that clear?" Without waiting for an answer, he guided Elizabeth out into the sunshine. A horse and buggy waited outside. Xavier must have arranged for it while she was gathering her things. "I thought we might need this," he explained, helping her into the passenger seat. "The ranch is a fair distance, and you're in no condition to walk." As they drove away from the Hargrove house, Elizabeth felt a strange lightness, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She turned to look at Xavier, finding him already watching her with a gentle expression that made her breath catch. "Thank you," she whispered. "I can't begin to repay you." "There's nothing to repay," he said simply. "No one deserves what they did to you." They traveled in comfortable silence for a while, the road taking them out of town and into the open countryside. Ash Fork fell behind them as Xavier guided the horse northeast, toward the sprawling rangeland that had once belonged to Old Man Collins. "It's about an hour's drive," Xavier told her. "The ranch house isn't fancy, but it's solid. Collins built it 30 years ago with good timber." "Have you been in Arizona long?" Elizabeth asked, curious about this man who had so unexpectedly changed her life. 6 months. "My Uncle Collins left me the place in his will surprised the hell out of me. I'd only met him a few times when I was a boy, but I'd been running cattle in Texas since I was 16, and I guess he figured I'd know what to do with the place." "And do you know what to do with it, I mean?" Xavier smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "I'm learning. The land here is different from Texas, drier in some ways with its own challenges, but the basics of ranching don't change much. Take care of the land, take care of the cattle, take care of your people." "Is that why you helped me? Because I'm one of your people now?" He glanced at her, his eyes serious again. "I helped you because it was the right thing to do, because no one should be treated the way they treated you." Elizabeth nodded, looking out at the landscape unfolding around them. The terrain was becoming more rugged, with red rock formations rising dramatically against the clear blue sky. It was beautiful in a stark, honest way that she found oddly comforting. "There it is," Xavier said some time later, pointing to a cluster of buildings in the distance. "Eastwood Ranch." As they drew closer, Elizabeth could make out a large main house built of timber and stone, several outbuildings, corrals, and a barn. It wasn't as grand as the Hargrove house, but it had a solid, welcoming appearance that immediately appealed to her. A few men were visible in the yard, working with horses or carrying supplies. They looked up as the buggy approached, raising hands in greeting when they recognized Xavier. "That's Monroe and Hank," Xavier explained, pointing to two older men. "They've been with the ranch since my uncle's time. The younger fellow is Charlie, best horse trainer in the territory. There are 3 more hands who are out with the herd right now." He pulled the buggy to a stop in front of the main house and jumped down, coming around to help Elizabeth descend. She was grateful for his steadying hand, as her legs felt surprisingly weak. "This is Elizabeth Nightingale," Xavier announced to the men who had gathered curiously. "She's our new housekeeper." The men touched their hats respectfully. "Madam," Monroe, a weathered man with graying hair, greeted her. "We're mighty glad to have you. Boss has been trying to cook for us, and let me tell you, it ain't pretty." Xavier laughed. "My talents lie elsewhere, that's for certain." Elizabeth felt a small smile tug at her lips. These men seemed so different from the Hargroves, straightforward, lacking in pretense. Even in her exhausted state, she could sense that this was a place where work was valued, but so were the people who performed it. "Let me show you the house," Xavier said, guiding her toward the front door. The interior of the ranch house was simple but comfortable. A large central room served as both parlor and dining area, with a massive stone fireplace at one end. Off this main space were several doors leading to bedrooms, Xavier explained, plus a well-equipped kitchen at the rear. "This will be your room," he said, opening a door to reveal a pleasant chamber with a real bed, not a cot or mattress on the floor, but a proper bed with a headboard and footboard, dressed with clean linens. There was a chest of drawers, a small desk, and even a rocking chair by the window which overlooked a small kitchen garden. Elizabeth stared in disbelief. "All this for me?" Xavier nodded, watching her reaction carefully. "Is it suitable?" "It's more than suitable," she whispered. "It's lovely." "Good, you should rest now. You've had a difficult day and you're clearly exhausted. We can discuss your duties tomorrow after you've had a chance to recover your strength." "But dinner," Elizabeth began, her sense of duty automatically asserting itself. "Can wait," Xavier finished firmly. "The men and I have managed this long. One more night won't hurt us." His expression softened. "Your job here is to take care of the house and prepare meals, yes. But Elizabeth, your first duty is to take care of yourself. I won't have you working yourself to illness like the Hargroves did." The concern in his voice brought unexpected tears to Elizabeth's eyes. She blinked them away quickly. "Thank you." Xavier hesitated, then reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "Rest. There's food in the kitchen if you get hungry later. Your life here begins tomorrow." After he left, Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the smooth quilt. Everything had happened so quickly that she could scarcely believe it was real. Just this morning, she had been a virtual prisoner in the Hargrove household, starving and afraid. Now she was free, with a proper room and the promise of fair treatment. Despite Xavier's suggestion that she rest, Elizabeth found herself drawn to explore her new domain. The kitchen was spacious and well-stocked, if somewhat disorganized. She could see immediately that it had lacked a woman's touch for some time. Practical necessities were present, but arranged with a man's indifference to efficiency. She opened cupboards, noting what supplies were available and what might be needed. There was plenty of flour, sugar, coffee, and dried beans. A cool pantry off the main kitchen held smoked meats, preserves, and root vegetables. It was more food than Elizabeth had been allowed to work with in years, and the sight of it made her hungry despite the substantial meal she'd had in town. Elizabeth helped herself to a small piece of bread and cheese, still cautious about overtaxing her shrunken stomach. As she ate, she continued to familiarize herself with the kitchen, mentally planning what she might prepare for breakfast the next day. The sound of boots on the porch alerted her to Xavier's return. He entered with an armload of firewood which he deposited beside the kitchen stove. "I thought you'd be resting," he said, brushing wood chips from his shirt. "I wanted to see the kitchen," Elizabeth explained. "To get a sense of things before tomorrow," Xavier smiled. "Always working. But I meant what I said, there's no rush. Take the time you need to recover your strength." "I'm stronger than I look," Elizabeth assured him, though even as she said it, she felt a wave of fatigue wash over her. The day's events and emotions had taken their toll. Xavier's gaze was knowing. "No doubt, but even the strongest need rest sometimes." He paused. "I've put fresh water in the pitcher in your room, and there's a bathhouse behind the kitchen if you'd like to wash up. It's simple, but private." The thought of a proper bath was almost too wonderful to contemplate. At the Hargroves, Elizabeth had been limited to hurried sponge baths with cold water. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Xavier nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Elizabeth." "Good night, Xavier." It was the first time she'd addressed him by his given name, and it felt strange on her tongue, intimate, yet right somehow. After he left, Elizabeth made her way back to her room. The bed was even more comfortable than it looked, and despite the tumult of the day, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep almost immediately. She woke to golden sunlight streaming through the window and the distant sounds of men's voices and horses in the yard. For a moment, Elizabeth was disoriented, unused to waking naturally rather than to Mrs. Hargrove's shrill commands. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and with them, a sense of purpose. Elizabeth dressed quickly in her spare dress, threadbare but clean, and smoothed her hair into a simple knot. She would need to purchase more suitable clothing when possible, but for now, this would have to do. The main room was empty when she entered, though the fire had been recently stoked. Elizabeth headed straight to the kitchen and set to work. Within an hour, she had coffee brewing, biscuits baking, and was preparing a substantial pot of oatmeal with dried apples. It felt good to work without fear, to know that she too would eat the food she prepared. Xavier found her there, humming softly as she removed a tray of golden biscuits from the oven. "Good morning," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "You didn't need to start so early." Elizabeth straightened, pushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "I'm used to early risings. And I wanted to have breakfast ready for you and the men. It smells amazing." Xavier stepped into the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "I should warn you, though the men might propose marriage when they taste real cooking again. They've been surviving on my burnt coffee and Monroe's leaden biscuits for months." Elizabeth laughed, the sound surprising her. It had been so long since she'd had reason to laugh. "I'll try to let them down gently." Xavier's eyes warmed at her mirth. "You should do that more often." "What?" "Laugh. It suits you." Elizabeth felt a blush rising to her cheeks and turned back to her biscuits. "Should I ring the bell for breakfast? I'll do it," Xavier offered, setting down his coffee cup. "And then I'll show you around the ranch after we eat if you're feeling up to it." The men arrived promptly at the sound of the bell, washing up at the pump outside before entering. They removed their hats as they came in, eyeing the laden table with undisguised enthusiasm. "Miss Nightingale," Monroe said, inhaling deeply, "if this tastes half as good as it smells, we're all gonna fight over who gets to marry you first." Elizabeth smiled, remembering Xavier's warning. "The food is payment enough for now, Mr. Monroe." The breakfast was a lively affair, with the men complimenting every dish and telling stories between bites. Elizabeth sat with them at Xavier's insistence, though it felt strange after years of eating alone in the Hargrove kitchen when she was allowed to eat at all. Watching Xavier with his men, she saw a different side of him. He was respected, certainly, but there was also an easy camaraderie that spoke of mutual trust. He listened when they spoke, considered their opinions, and shared both responsibilities and credit freely. It was leadership of a kind Elizabeth had never witnessed at the Hargroves, where authority was maintained through fear and intimidation. After breakfast, the men returned to their duties, and Xavier made good on his promise to show Elizabeth the ranch. They walked first through the immediate surroundings: the barn, corrals, smokehouse, and tool shed. Then Xavier saddled a gentle mare for Elizabeth and his own stallion for himself. "Can you ride?" he asked, helping her mount. "A little," Elizabeth admitted. "My father taught me when I was young, but it's been years." "Buttercup here is steady as they come," Xavier assured her, adjusting the stirrups to fit her shorter legs. "She'll take good care of you." The ride was revelatory. The Collins, now Eastwood Ranch, covered thousands of acres, from valley grasslands ideal for grazing to rocky highlands, where Xavier pointed out wild horses that sometimes mingled with his own herds. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said as they paused on a ridge overlooking a stream where cattle were watering. "I never realized how vast it was." "It's good land," Xavier agreed. "Challenging sometimes, but good. My uncle chose well when he settled here." As they rode, Xavier explained his operations, the breeding program he was implementing to improve his stock, his plans for expanding into new grazing areas, the improvements he wanted to make to the ranch buildings. Elizabeth listened attentively, asking questions that revealed her quick intelligence. "You understand more about ranching than I would have expected," Xavier remarked as they turned back toward the house. Elizabeth shrugged slightly. "I read whatever books I could find at the Hargroves." Mr. Hargrove subscribed to several agricultural journals, though he rarely looked at them himself. "And before that, my father was a small farmer. I grew up learning about growing things, caring for animals." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "Books are valuable, but there's no substitute for hands-on experience. You'll get plenty of that here." By the time they returned to the ranch house, Elizabeth's muscles were protesting the unaccustomed activity, but she felt more alive than she had in years. The fresh air, the exercise, the simple pleasure of conversation with someone who treated her as an equal, all of it was intoxicating after so long in the Hargrove's stifling household. The days that followed fell into a pleasant rhythm. Elizabeth rose early to prepare breakfast, then spent her mornings putting the neglected ranch house in order. The afternoons were devoted to baking, preparing supper, and sometimes accompanying Xavier on short rides to various parts of the ranch. In the evenings, the men often gathered in the main room, talking or playing cards while Elizabeth mended clothing or worked on other small projects. Xavier was unfailingly kind, ensuring that Elizabeth had everything she needed for the house and occasionally bringing her small gifts from his trips to town: a length of calico for a new dress, a tin of special tea, once even a book of poetry that he'd noticed her admiring in the general store. 2 weeks after her arrival, Elizabeth was in the kitchen preparing the evening meal when Xavier entered, carrying a large parcel. "What's this?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Open it and see," he suggested, his eyes twinkling with barely suppressed excitement. Elizabeth untied the string and unfolded the brown paper to reveal several lengths of sturdy cotton fabric in practical colors, along with thread, buttons, and other sewing notions. "I noticed your dresses are wearing thin," Xavier explained. "Mrs. Patterson at the general store helped me select materials that would be suitable for working around the ranch. I hope I wasn't presumptuous." Elizabeth ran her fingers over the fabrics, touched beyond words by his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect, thank you." "There's something else," Xavier added, reaching into his vest pocket. He pulled out a small envelope and handed it to her. "Your first month's wages. I know it hasn't quite been a full month yet, but I thought you might need it." Elizabeth opened the envelope to find more money than she had ever held in her life. "This is too much," she protested. "It's the going rate for a housekeeper of your caliber," Xavier insisted. "You've transformed this place, Elizabeth. The men are happier, better fed, more comfortable. That has value beyond measure." She looked up at him, finding his gaze warm and sincere. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay," he replied softly. "Say this is becoming home for you as it has for me." The intensity in his voice made Elizabeth's heart quicken. "It is," she admitted. "More of a home than I've known in years." Xavier's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Good. That's good." There was a moment of charged silence between them, broken only when Charlie called from outside that one of the mares was foaling and Xavier was needed in the barn. As summer progressed into early fall, Elizabeth flourished. Regular meals, rest, and freedom from fear had worked a transformation. Her hollow cheeks filled out, her dull hair regained its natural chestnut luster, and there was a new confidence in her step. The new dresses she'd made from Xavier's gift of fabric fit her recovering figure perfectly, and she no longer looked like the half-starved creature who had arrived at the ranch. For his part, Xavier found himself increasingly drawn to her. What had begun as concern and a desire to help had evolved into genuine admiration for her resilience, intelligence, and quiet strength. He discovered that he sought out her company whenever possible, valuing her practical suggestions about the ranch and enjoying their conversations about books, ideas, and the wider world. One evening in late September, Elizabeth was sitting on the front porch, shelling peas for the next day's dinner and enjoying the sunset. Xavier joined her, settling into the chair beside hers with a contented sigh. "Good day?" she asked, noting his relaxed posture. "Very." "The new breeding stock arrived from Texas, all healthy and better than I'd hoped. And Monroe says we'll have a good crop of calves come spring." "That's wonderful news." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the soft clicking of peas dropping into the bowl and the distant lowing of cattle being brought in for the night. "I've been thinking," Xavier said finally, "about the future of the ranch." "Oh." Elizabeth's hand stilled momentarily. "It's growing. Faster than I expected. There's talk of the railroad extending a spur line closer to Ash Fork next year, which would make shipping cattle easier. I'm considering expanding the operation, maybe adding sheep on the western grazing lands." "That sounds sensible," Elizabeth agreed. "Diversifying would provide some protection against fluctuations in the cattle market." Xavier smiled at her business acumen. "Exactly my thinking," he hesitated. "But expansion means more work, more men, more everything." "You're certainly capable of managing it," Elizabeth assured him. "Perhaps, but I've been thinking that such an enterprise needs more than just a capable manager. It needs a partner, someone who shares the vision, who has a stake in its success." Elizabeth's heart began to beat faster. "I'm sure you'll find the right person," she said carefully. Xavier turned to face her fully. "I already have," he said softly, "if she'll have me." The bowl of peas nearly slipped from Elizabeth's lap. "Xavier, I'm not asking out of convenience, Elizabeth," he said quickly, "or obligation. These past months, getting to know you, watching you overcome everything the Hargroves did to you, seeing your intelligence and strength, I've fallen in love with you." Elizabeth stared at him, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "But I'm just your housekeeper. You're far more than that." "You always have been." Xavier took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "You're the woman I want to build a life with, the woman I want beside me as my equal, my partner, my wife." Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes. "I never thought," I never dared hope. Is that a yes?" Xavier asked, his own voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Elizabeth whispered. "Yes, I'll be your wife, your partner, in everything." Xavier's face lit with a joy so profound that it took Elizabeth's breath away. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was both tender and filled with promise. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "From the moment I saw you at the Hargroves, something in me recognized something in you. I didn't understand it then, but I do now." "What was it?" Elizabeth asked, her heart full to bursting. "That you deserved better, that you were meant for more. That underneath the fear and hunger, there was a woman of extraordinary courage." He kissed her again, briefly. "And that somehow, improbably, we were meant to find each other." The news of their engagement was met with enthusiasm by the ranch hands, who had come to respect Elizabeth deeply. Plans were made for a simple ceremony in Ash Fork the following month, with the local minister officiating and the entire ranch in attendance. Word spread quickly through the small community. Most reactions were positive. The townspeople had never liked the Hargroves much, and many had worried about Elizabeth during her time with them. But when the Hargroves themselves heard the news, their response was less charitable. 3 days before the wedding, Elizabeth was in town with Xavier, selecting final supplies for the ceremony and celebration, when they encountered Mrs. Hargrove outside the general store. "Well, well," the older woman said coldly, "if it isn't the thief and her protector." Xavier's arm tightened around Elizabeth's waist. "Mrs. Hargrove," he acknowledged tersely, "we have no quarrel with you. Please let us pass." "No quarrel. After you stole our servant and turned her against us. The ungrateful wretch was nothing when we took her, and no family, no prospects. We gave her everything, and how did she repay us? By running off with the first man who showed an interest." Elizabeth felt Xavier tense beside her, but before he could respond, she stepped forward. "You gave me nothing but cruelty," she said quietly but firmly. "You worked me nearly to death and starved me when I couldn't work harder. You took my wages, my dignity, and very nearly my life." She lifted her chin. "But you didn't take my spirit. That's what truly angers you, isn't it? That despite everything, you couldn't break me." Mrs. Hargrove's face contorted with rage. "That's enough," Xavier interrupted, his voice like steel. "You've said your piece, Mrs. Hargrove. Now I suggest you move on before you say something you'll regret." For a moment, it seemed the older woman might continue her tirade, but something in Xavier's expression made her think better of it. With a final venomous glare at Elizabeth, she swept past them and into the store. "Are you all right?" Xavier asked when she was gone, searching Elizabeth's face with concern. To his surprise, Elizabeth smiled. "Yes, better than all right, actually." She took a deep breath. "For years I was terrified of her, of both of them, but standing here now, seeing her for what she truly is, I realize she has no power over me anymore, none at all." Xavier's expression softened with pride and love. "You are the strongest person I've ever known, Elizabeth Nightingale." "Soon to be Elizabeth Eastwood," she reminded him with a smile that lit her entire face. Their wedding day dawned clear and crisp, with the first hints of autumn gilding the cottonwood trees along the creek. The small church in Ash Fork was filled to capacity with ranchers, townspeople, and the entire staff of Eastwood Ranch. Elizabeth wore a simple gown of ivory silk that Xavier had ordered specially from Prescott, with tiny pearl buttons down the back and a modest train. Her hair was arranged in a crown of braids interwoven with white rosebuds, and she carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers gathered by Charlie's wife that morning. When Xavier first saw her walking down the aisle toward him, his breath caught in his throat. She was radiant, transformed not just by the elegant dress, but by the confidence and joy that shone from within her. This was a far cry from the frightened, starving maid he had met at the Hargrove's dinner party less than 6 months ago. The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. Elizabeth and Xavier exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising not only love and fidelity, but also partnership and mutual respect. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed his bride with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of even the most hardened cowboys present. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and enough food to feed the entire county. Elizabeth had overseen the preparations herself, determined that no one would leave hungry, a reflection, perhaps, of her own experiences. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the land that was now truly their shared home, Xavier found Elizabeth standing slightly apart from the festivities, gazing out at the horizon. "Having second thoughts, Mrs. Eastwood?" he asked, sliding his arms around her waist from behind. Elizabeth leaned back against him, savoring the solid warmth of his chest. "Not one," she assured him. "I was just thinking about how much has changed, how much I've changed. For the better, I hope." She turned in his arms to face him. "Beyond anything I could have imagined. 6 months ago I was barely surviving. Now I'm not just living, I'm thriving. I have purpose, respect." She reached up to touch his face gently. "And love, so much love." Xavier covered her hand with his own. "You know that first night at the Hargroves when I told you to eat until you were full? I had no idea I was really inviting you to a feast that would last a lifetime." "A feast of more than just food," Elizabeth agreed softly. "Of love," Xavier murmured, bending to kiss her. "Of partnership, of building something meaningful together." As twilight deepened into night, the newlyweds moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music, dancing, and laughter filling the ranch yard. It was past midnight when the last guests departed, and Xavier carried his bride across the threshold of the main house, now officially their shared home in every sense. The months that followed were busy ones for the Eastwoods. Winter brought its own challenges to ranch life, with heavy snows and bitter winds testing both cattle and humans. But the ranch house remained a haven of warmth and comfort, with Elizabeth's steady presence at its heart. By spring, evidence of the ranch's prosperity was everywhere: healthy calves, expanding herds, new buildings under construction. But the greatest joy came with the news, confirmed by the doctor in Ash Fork, that Elizabeth was expecting their first child. "A baby," Xavier said in wonder, his hand gently cradling the still flat plane of his wife's abdomen. "Our baby." Elizabeth covered his hand with her own. "Our family," she corrected with a smile. "The beginning of it, anyway." As her pregnancy progressed, Xavier became increasingly protective, insisting that Elizabeth hire help for the more strenuous household tasks. She agreed, but remained active in managing the ranch alongside her husband, her shrewd business sense and practical approach complementing his vision and experience. Their son was born in the first days of winter, a healthy, robust boy they named James, after Elizabeth's father. Xavier held the infant with a mixture of awe and terror, his hands that could break a wild horse suddenly unsure how to cradle something so tiny and precious. "He has your eyes," Elizabeth said softly, watching her husband and son together. "And your determination," Xavier replied, as the baby gripped his finger with surprising strength. "He'll be a force to be reckoned with, this one." Elizabeth smiled, her heart so full she thought it might burst. From the desperate hunger of her days with the Hargroves to this abundance of love and security, It was a journey she could scarcely comprehend. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "About hunger," she answered honestly, "and fullness. About how you told me that very first day to eat until I was full." She looked around at their home, at her husband and newborn son. "I never imagined that fullness could mean this." Xavier settled beside her on the bed, their son cradled between them. "This is just the beginning," he promised. "We have a lifetime of fullness ahead." And as the years proved, he was right. The Eastwood Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Their family grew to include a daughter, Sarah, born 2 years after James, and later, twin boys who arrived as a surprise when Elizabeth was in her 36th year. The children grew up strong and capable, nurtured by parents who understood the value of both discipline and freedom, of work and play, of abundance shared generously. James eventually took over the ranch's day-to-day operations, while Sarah surprised everyone by studying medicine and becoming one of Arizona's first female doctors. Through it all, Elizabeth and Xavier's partnership remained the bedrock upon which everything else was built. Their love deepened with each challenge faced together, each triumph shared, each moment of quiet understanding in a life filled with activity. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire community gathered at the ranch to celebrate. The Eastwood Ranch had become not just a successful business, but a cornerstone of the region, known for its fair dealings and generous support of those in need. As the festivities wound down and guests began to depart, Xavier found Elizabeth in the same spot where he had proposed to her so many years before, on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the land in hues of gold and crimson. Feeling nostalgic, he asked, settling beside her, his hair now streaked with silver but his eyes as warm as ever. "Grateful," Elizabeth corrected, reaching for his hand. "For that day you found me at the Hargroves, for your courage in helping me leave, for every day since." Xavier brought her hand to his lips. "I've never done anything wiser than asking you to come to this ranch, to build this life with me." Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she once would not have believed possible. The hunger that had defined her early years was now just a distant memory, replaced by a fullness that encompassed every aspect of her existence: home, family, purpose, love. "Eat until you're full here," Xavier had told her on that first day of freedom. And she had not just with food for her body, but with nourishment for her soul. The feast had indeed lasted a lifetime and promised to continue for generations to come. As twilight deepened into darkness, the Eastwoods remained on their porch, 2 figures silhouetted against the warm light spilling from their home, their hands linked in a connection that had weathered a quarter-century and would endure for all their remaining days. From starvation to abundance, from loneliness to love, from servitude to partnership, it was a journey neither could have imagined, but one they had been destined to make together.